Some stories don't begin with a grand entrance or a dramatic twist. Sometimes they begin in the silence of a garage, with dust floating in the sunbeams. The faint sound of old music playing from another room, and a woman who hadn't asked for help until she did. I never thought that helping someone move boxes would change how I looked at companionship, aging, and the unspoken loneliness we carry. But by the time she whispered those words to me, "Please don't go, I'm scared to be alone," I realized this wasn't just another job. This was something deeper, something human, something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time I pulled up to the small blue house tucked at the end of a quiet street, I didn't expect anything unusual. I was just there to help an older client named Evelyn move some boxes from her attic to her garage. It was a gig I picked up through a local home assistance service for seniors, something I did in between bigger jobs. The house wasn't in disrepair, but there was something weary about it. The paint was clean but faded, the garden was trimmed but empty, and the windows seemed like they hadn't been opened in a long time. It felt like a place that hadn't heard laughter in years. When she opened the door, Evelyn looked exactly how I imagined someone in their early 50s might after a few lonely winters. She had short, wavy, silver blonde hair and a navy cardigan that looked like it had seen 1,000 mornings and still held on. Her smile was polite, not forced, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a tiredness there, not just physical, but emotional, like someone who had once been vibrant and full of light, but had quietly turned down the volume on her own life. She introduced herself softly, and I offered my name, Noah. She thanked me and led me inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. It was clean but lived in, like it had been home to someone who spent a lot of time alone. Walls were lined with framed photographs, most of them faded. I noticed a man in several of them standing beside Evelyn in what looked like various decades of their life.
Nice.
Her husband, I assumed. There were no signs of children in the pictures. Just the two of them? That told me more than I expected. The attic stairs creaked under our weight as we made our way up. I offered to carry everything down myself, but she insisted on showing me what to take. We worked in silence for a while, surrounded by cardboard, boxes labeled with words like winter clothes, dad's books, and wedding things. The dust clung to the air, and the only sound was the rustle of paper and the occasional soft sigh from Evelyn. Every time I turned to her with another box in hand, she was looking away, lost in thought, or perhaps memory. After about an hour, we took a break. She poured us each a glass of water, and we sat on her front steps, the sunlight warming our legs. That's when she told me the boxers had been sitting up there for nearly 5 years, since her husband passed. She didn't say it like it was a grand confession, more like a fact she was still getting used to sharing. I didn't pry. I just nodded. And maybe that silence, that lack of forced sympathy, is what made her continue talking. She said his name was Martin. They had been together for over 30 years. No kids, just each other. They'd met at a bookstore. Back when people still met in bookstores, she joked. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who could fix anything except time. Cancer, she said, it happened fast. Too fast. One moment they were talking about adopting a dog, and the next, she was standing in an empty kitchen listening to his voicemail, just to hear his voice again. I didn't know what to say.
Oh, so I didn't say much.
Sometimes presence matters more than words. Over the next few hours, we fell into a rhythm. I carried boxes. She sorted through them. Occasionally she'd pause, holding up an old photo or a keepsake, and tell me a quick story about where it came from. Some made her laugh, a kind of hushed, nostalgic chuckle, and others made her quiet. I noticed she kept touching her left ring finger, where the indentation of a once permanent band still lingered like a shadow. Just as we were finishing the last of the heavy lifting, a voice called out from the next yard, "Neighbor Martha." I think waved from behind her fence, asking Evelyn if she needed anything from the store. Evelyn thanked her and said she was fine. Martha looked at me, gave a polite nod, and said, "It's good she has company." Then she disappeared behind the fence. That comment lingered with me. When I was done for the day, Evelyn walked me to the door. She looked tired but somehow lighter, like lifting those boxes had unburdened more than her attic. Just as I was about to step outside, she reached out and lightly touched my arm. "Noah," she said, barely above a whisper, "would you mind? Could you come back tomorrow? There's still a few more I need help with," and she hesitated, her eyes glossy but not crying. "It's just been quiet. Too quiet. I think I'd talk more when someone's around." I told her I'd come back. It wasn't just the work. Something in me wanted to know more about this woman who wore her grief like a second skin and still managed to make space for strangers. That night, I lay in bed thinking about her words. I'd met dozens of clients in my line of work, but Evelyn felt different. She wasn't broken. She wasn't fragile. She was just unfinished, paused somewhere between mourning and moving forward. And maybe, just maybe, I had something to offer besides muscle and tools. I didn't know then how much that next visit would change things. I arrived the next morning just after 10. The sky was clouded over with a soft grayness that made everything feel muted, like the world had turned down its brightness for a while. Evelyn answered the door wearing a thick cream sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose twist. She looked surprised when she saw me, though she had been the one to ask me to return. Maybe she hadn't really expected me to follow through. I think people in her life had probably let her down before. Maybe not maliciously, but through slow disappearances in silence. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with my work gloves and tool belts slung around my hip, she gave a small smile and stepped aside to let me in. No words were needed in that moment. It felt like the kind of silence you share with someone who's been waiting for something, but never wanted to say it out loud. We headed to the garage where I had placed the boxes the day before. There were still about half a dozen left in the attic, but Evelyn suggested we sort through the ones we had first. As I opened the first box, I noticed it was filled with old records. Some still in their sleeves, others worn at the edges like they'd been played on loop for decades. She picked up one with a faded red label and held it for a long time before placing it aside. She said Martin used to play jazz in the evenings while they cooked together. He had a thing for Coltrane, she said, and I could hear the smile buried in her voice. As we sorted through the records, she hummed quietly. Not a song I knew, but it seemed familiar in the way old songs always do. The next box was labeled Christmas. Inside were delicate glass ornaments, some broken, some perfectly intact, all wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. She pulled out a small wooden reindeer with a crooked leg and held it in her hands like it was made of porcelain. She said Martin made it during their second Christmas together, and even though it never stood quite right, they always placed it front and center on the mantel. She didn't cry, not yet, but her fingers lingered on the reindeer longer than necessary. And then she placed it back in the box, as if tucking away a memory too fragile for daylight. As we worked, I started noticing little things about the house. The way the curtains were always pulled halfway open, letting in just enough light but never too much. The way the fridge had a single photo pinned with a magneto picture of Evelyn and Martin on a dock somewhere, both of them holding fishing poles and laughing at something outside the frame. There was a calendar on the wall, but the days hadn't been marked in weeks. No doctor's appointments, no dinners, no reminders. Just blank squares like a life waiting to be filled again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. IT means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. After a couple of hours, Evelyn offered lunch grilled cheese and tomato soup. We sat at her small kitchen table, sunlight casting faint shadows through the window. She talked a little more this time, about the neighborhood. How it used to be filled with kids running around, riding bikes, playing tag after school. Now, it was quieter. A lot of older folks, or newer couples who kept to themselves. She said the hardest part of losing someone wasn't just the grief, but how the silence changed shape over time.
At first,
It was loud and sharp like a siren. Then it settled into something softer but heavier, like a blanket you couldn't shake off. She didn't say these things for pity. It just came out in the way people talk when they've been holding words in too long. After lunch, we went back to the boxes. This time we opened one marked letters. It was filled with envelopes. Tied in string, most of them from Martin, some from old friends. She opened one and handed it to me to read. It was dated 1994. In it, Martin had written about a weekend getaway they took in the mountains. He described how Evelyn had worn this ridiculous oversized hat and how she made fun of his cooking, even though she secretly loved it. It was playful, warm, full of life. As I read it aloud, Evelyn watched me with a soft smile, like hearing his words through another voice brought him back, even for a moment. I handed the letter back to her, and she folded it gently, tucking it away like a sacred thing. We worked in silence again after that, but this time it felt different. There was comfort in it, like we didn't need to fill the air with conversation to feel understood. At some point, the clouds outside shifted, and the living room glowed gold for a moment as the sun peeked through. Evelyn looked up and said, "He always used to say, golden hour made everything look softer. Even me." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. There was nothing I could add that wouldn't sound small. It was nearing 4 when I told her I should get going. She nodded and walked me to the door. As I stepped out onto the porch, she followed, her sweater pulled tightly around her. Then she hesitated, her hand on the doorframe, eyes not meeting mine. That's when she whispered it. "Please don't." "Go," she said, barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I'm scared to be alone." The words came out like they'd been waiting for years, not just days. They weren't dramatic. They weren't desperate. They were just real, raw, human. Froze for a second. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because it hit me how rare it is for someone to be that open, that honest. In a world where people hide behind small talk and smiles, she had chosen to lay bare her fear. I turned back to her and said gently, "I'll come back tomorrow, not just for the boxes." She didn't respond right away, but I saw her shoulders relax, her lips part slightly like she'd been holding her breath, and finally let it out. That night, I sat in my truck a little longer than usual before heading home. I thought about all the things people carry that no one ever sees, not just the physical boxes in attics and garages, but the emotional ones, memories, regrets, fears, and hopes tucked away in corners of the heart. Evelyn wasn't asking me to fix anything. She was asking me to witness it, to be there, even just for a while. Somehow that felt like the most important work I'd done in years. The next morning, I didn't need an alarm to wake me. I was already up before the sun rose, lying in bed and thinking about Evelyn's voice, soft and shaken, as she'd whispered those 7 words, "Please don't go. I'm scared to be alone." It haunted me, not in a heavy way, but in a way that felt like it had carved itself into my memory. I kept seeing her standing there in the doorway, framed by the soft light from her living room, holding her cardigan around her like armor against a world that had grown too quiet. I got ready slower than usual, but not because I was tired. I wanted to be present, clear-headed. I wasn't just going to help with boxes anymore. Felt like I was being led into something fragile and personal, something that needed to be handled with care. When I arrived at Evelyn's house, she opened the door before I could knock. It startled me a little. She smiled faintly and said she'd been watching from the window and didn't want me to think she'd changed her mind. That made me wonder if others had made her feel forgotten after offering their time, I reassured her without words, just a small smile and a nod, and she stepped aside to let me in. The house felt warmer today. Whether that was from the sunlight or the shift in her spirit, I couldn't say. Something had changed in the atmosphere. Less tension in the air, more lightness in her movements. It was subtle, but I noticed we picked up where we left off. Back to the garage, back to the remaining boxes. She had cleared a little space near the wall, set up a small folding table with an old lamp, and brought in 2 folding chairs. "If we're going to dig through memories," she said, "we might as well be comfortable." I liked that. She said we. There was comfort in that word. We. Together. The next box was labeled keepsakes. It was filled with smaller items: a locket, some postcards, an old camera with a frayed strap, and a ticket stub from a concert dated 1987. She picked up the locket and turned it over in her fingers, opening it slowly to reveal a tiny photograph. Inside her and Martin laughing under a tree. The image was so small it was almost blurred, but you could still see the happiness in their eyes. She held it out to me for a moment, letting me see it up close, then tucked it into her pocket, like she wasn't ready to put it back just yet. We spent the next hour sorting quietly. Occasionally, she'd ask me to open a particularly dusty box or lift something heavier off the shelf. I did it all without question. I started to recognize certain patterns about her. She always brushed her fingers lightly across items before putting them down, as if every object deserved a silent goodbye. She never rushed through anything, even when it got emotional. There was patience in her grief, acceptance, but also loneliness. The kind that builds like a layer of dust on forgotten things. Eventually, she told me a little more about her life after Martin. How the house had grown quieter over the years. How people used to stop by more often, right after he passed, bringing casseroles and sympathy. But time has a way of erasing urgency. The calls slowed, the visits stopped, friends got busy, moved away, or didn't know what to say anymore. Evelyn never blamed them. She understood. But understanding didn't fill the space he left behind. I asked her if she ever considered moving, downsizing, maybe. She shook her head slowly. This house is more than just walls, she said. It's the only place that still remembers. Us both. I thought about that long after she said it.
Idea that a place could hold memory the way people do?
Maybe that's why she couldn't let go of the boxes. Maybe they were more than clutter. Maybe they were proofed as the day wore on. We made our way through more keepsakes. She let out a soft laugh when she found a hand-drawn birthday card Martin had made her during their first year together. He couldn't draw to save his life, she said, showing me a stick figure version of her with exaggerated eyelashes and wild hair. But he tried, and that meant something. It always had. There were also a few letters from her own mother, written in the early 80s, filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes with age and distance. Evelyn read one aloud. It talked about resilience and choosing kindness even when the world doesn't give it back. I watched her as she read, the words settling into her like warm tea on a cold day. After a while, she excused herself to make tea and told me to take a break. I wandered around the living room, looking at the photographs. Again, I noticed one I hadn't paid attention to before, tucked behind a small vase on a shelf. It was Evelyn in her 20s, standing in front of an art gallery with a paintbrush in her hand. She looked radiant, alive. I asked her about it when she came back with the tea. She smiled and said she used to paint, back when she thought dreams were still things you could chase without guilt. But then life happened, she added with a shrug. I asked her if she still painted. She said no, not in a long time. I told her it was never too late to start again. She gave me a look that held both appreciation and disbelief. Like she wanted to believe me but didn't quite know how to. We sipped our tea in silence for a few minutes. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "You know, when you lose someone, people always say time heals. But it doesn't. Not really. Just makes the pain more quiet, like background noise. But some days, it's just as loud as ever." Her voice cracked slightly at the end. She looked down into her cup, not embarrassed, just honest. I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over hers. It wasn't a bold move. It wasn't romantic. It was just human. Her fingers trembled under mine for a moment before she turned her hand and held on. No words were exchanged. They weren't needed. We finished the last box just before sunset. Evelyn stood and stretched, and I could hear the creak of her joints. She laughed softly and said, "You make me feel young again." Not in a silly way, in a remembered way. I smiled but didn't say anything. She looked out the window and said she hadn't felt this connected to another person in years. Then she turned back to me and added, "Thank you for showing up." That night, before I left, she handed me a photograph. It was one of her and Martin sitting on the porch, each with a cup of coffee, looking at each other instead of the camera. "Just so you know who you're helping," she said. I took it and nodded, unsure if I was supposed to keep it or just hold on to it for a moment. She didn't clarify. I still have it. As I walked to my truck, I glanced back at the house. The porch light was on, and Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching me leave. She didn't say anything this time. She didn't need to.
Oh.
I knew I'd be back, not just for her, but for the story we were slowly unfolding, one box at a time. The following morning carried a chill that crept under my collar as I stepped out of the truck and made my way toward Evelyn's front door. The sky was pale, overcast and quiet, a stillness that matched how I'd been feeling since the night before. I hadn't told anyone about what Evelyn had said or how she held my hand across that folding table or the way her voice cracked when she talked about grief. Some things aren't meant to be shared, at least not with people who weren't there to witness it. It wasn't just her vulnerability that stayed with me. It was the way she offered it, not as a burden, but as a form of trust. I was beginning to understand that this story I was walking into wasn't just hers. It was becoming mine too. She opened the door before I knocked again, wearing a soft green sweater and a scarf around her neck. She looked better rested, but her eyes still held that cautious kindness, like she was still trying to figure out how much space she could safely give someone new in her life. We greeted each other with quiet smiles and no need for small talk. That had already faded away between us. There's a kind of intimacy that grows in shared silence, and by then, we were both growing used to it. Today's task was a little different. Evelyn told me there were a few boxes in the basement that hadn't been touched since Martin passed. She admitted she had been avoiding them, not because they were too heavy, but because they carried a weight that didn't show up on a scale. I didn't push. I simply followed her down the narrow staircase, each step creaking beneath our feet. The basement was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and old fabric. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a yellow halo over the boxes, piled neatly along the far wall. Most were unmarked, just taped shut, edges softened with time, and corners beginning to sag. We started with the top box. Inside were sweaters, coats, a couple of scarves, and a single brown leather glove. Evelyn reached in and picked up one of the coats, pressing it against her chest for a moment before folding it neatly. She told me Martin had always been cold, even in the fall. He used to wear layers before the weather even required it. I imagined them walking through the park together, him bundled up, her teasing him about dressing for winter in October. One by one, we opened the boxes. Most contained clothes, old photo frames, and a few gadgets I couldn't quite place. A dusty slide projector, a coffee grinder, a cassette player with a cracked speaker. She touched each item like she was remembering not just how it was used, but how it fit into their life. The projector, she explained, had been their way of reliving vacations. Martin used to take slides on every trip, then host their own little movie nights in the living room with popcorn and homemade cocktails. She smiled when she said that part, and I could almost picture it, the flickering light of the projector on the wall. The two of them curled up on the couch, laughing at a blurry photo of someone's finger accidentally covering the lens. At one point, she pulled out a pair of hiking boots, laces frayed and soles worn thin. "We hiked everywhere," she said, her voice soft with memory. Mountains, coastlines, even just the hills out back. He always said he felt closest to himself. When he was outdoors, she held the boots in her lap for a long moment, then set them aside gently. I didn't ask what she planned to do with them. Some things aren't meant to be thrown away or donated. Some things are simply meant to be held once more around midday. Evelyn offered tea again, and we returned to the kitchen. This time she had made scones, slightly overbaked, but full of flavor, and she laughed at herself as we bit into them. "Martin was the baker," she said. "I just pretended I could follow a recipe." Her eyes sparkled with mischief, and for a brief moment, I saw the version of her that Martin must have fallen in love with all those years ago. Not the woman weathered by grief, but the woman who teased and joked and made a mess in the kitchen on purpose. We sat across from each other. Again, this time more relaxed. She asked about me, finally turning the conversation around. I told her about growing up in a small town, working odd jobs through high school, and eventually falling into handyman work, because it allowed me to meet people and keep moving. I told her about my brother, about how we used to fix bikes and the garage, and raced them down the street like we were in the Tour de France. I told her about my mom, who raised us on her own and taught me how to use a hammer and a paintbrush before I ever held a pencil properly. Evelyn listened closely, nodding, asking thoughtful questions. She wasn't just being polite, she was curious, genuine. It felt good to be heard. Like that, I admitted that sometimes I didn't know where I was going in life, that the jobs were steady but temporary, that some nights I wondered if I was just drifting from house to house, looking for something without knowing what it was. She didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she said maybe the houses are looking for you too. Maybe some people just need someone to witness their stories. For a little while, that hit me harder than I expected. She had a way of seeing through people without making them feel exposed. After tea, we returned to the basement. There was only one box left. It was smaller than the others and tucked behind a plastic storage bin. Evelyn hesitated before reaching for it. She sat down slowly and opened the lid. Inside were notebooks, sketch pads, and a small bundle of canvas sheets. She lifted one and unfolded it, a watercolor painting of a tree in autumn, leaves bursting in shades of orange and red. It was beautiful, delicate, and surprisingly bold. I looked at her, surprised. "You said you hadn't painted in years," I said quietly. She shrugged, eyes still on the artwork. "I haven't. These are from before. When Martin was alive, I used to paint all the time. He'd hang them up around the house, even the ones I hated. He said they made the rooms feel alive." She flipped through a few more pieces. A cityscape, a mountain range, a portrait of a cat I assumed they once had. She paused on that one, touching the corner of the paper like it was fur. "You should paint again," I said, not as a suggestion, but as a truth. She didn't answer, but she didn't dismiss it either. By the time we finished in the basement, the light outside had dimmed into the soft amber of late afternoon. We stood at the bottom of the stairs, and Evelyn looked at me with something new in her expression. Not gratitude, but a kind of quiet strength. "Thank you," she said, her voice even, "for helping me face this. Didn't think I could." "You didn't do it alone," I said. And I meant it in more ways than one. That evening, I lingered before leaving. Evelyn walked me to the porch again, and this time, she placed her hand on my arm before I could step down. "Would you stay for dinner?" she asked. "It's just leftovers, but I think I'd like the company." I said yes without hesitation. Dinner that evening was quiet, but in a way that felt full rather than empty. Evelyn had heated up a vegetable stew and served it with warm slices of sourdough bread that she'd bought from the local market. The kitchen was dimly lit, with only the overhead pendant light casting a gentle glow onto the table between us. She'd set it simply: two mismatched plates, folded cloth napkins, and a candle that flickered in a glass jar like it was marking the occasion. The silence between us wasn't awkward. In fact, it felt like the kind of silence people earn after a long day spent doing something meaningful together. Our words had already been exchanged through boxes and old letters and shared stories. We didn't need to force more of them right away. Still, conversation came. She asked me how I liked the stew, and I told her it was perfect. She admitted it was Martin's recipe, and that she still followed it to the letter, even now. Not because she was trying to hold on, but because the smell of thyme and garlic made the house feel like him again, like he was still sitting at the head of the table, asking her about her day. She smiled at the memory, but I could tell it carried a mix of comfort and ache. She didn't linger in it too long. Evelyn was the kind of woman who knew how to visit a memory without drowning in it as we ate. She asked more questions about my life: whether I had siblings, if I'd ever been married, whether I'd always lived in the area. I told her I had a younger sister who'd moved to Oregon years ago, and that I tried to visit when I could. I mentioned that I had come close to marriage once, a long time ago, but that we'd grown apart before it ever reached that point. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any. Some things weren't about heartbreak. They were just about timing, about two people realizing they were walking different roads in the same direction for a while, till the path split and no one turned back. Evelyn nodded knowingly, as if she'd known that kind of goodbye. After we cleared the dishes, she offered coffee, and I accepted. The kitchen window framed the evening sky now, a dusky blue beginning to bleed into black. The stars just starting to wake up. She moved slowly, intentionally, pulling mugs from the cupboard and filling the kettle with water. Everything she did had a rhythm to it, a care that made even the simplest tasks feel like rituals. I watched her and thought about how many times she must have done this for someone else. How many nights she'd made dinner for two and sat across from a man she loved, never expecting to one day do it alone. We carried the coffee into the living room where she turned on a small lamp and curled up in her chair while I sat on the couch. Her walls were lined with books, novels, memoirs, art books stacked in neat piles. She had a woven throw blanket draped over the armrest, and a small side table with an old radio that played soft instrumental music in the background. Everything about the space felt lived in, like a story still unfolding. She asked me if I ever got tired of meeting strangers every day, of moving from one home to another, always on the edge of people's lives. I hadn't really thought about it in that way before. I told her I liked the variety, the change of scenery, the lack of repetition. I also admitted that sometimes when the job was over, it left behind a certain emptiness, like being part of something briefly and then vanishing before you could ever belong. She looked at me then, not with sympathy, but with recognition. You know, she said, some people come into our lives for only a season, but they change the way the whole year feels. It was a simple sentence, but it hit me like a quiet revelation. Maybe I had been moving through all these jobs, all these houses, waiting to feel something more permanent. And here, in this quiet room with Evelyn sipping coffee beside me, it felt like I'd found a pause in that motion, a stillness I hadn't realized I needed. We talked more that evening about art, about travel, about the way people carry their losses like invisible bags over their shoulders. She told me how she used to write poetry, that she'd even had a few pieces published in a small literary magazine once. She hadn't written anything since Martin died. Words stopped making sense for a while, she said. It's like grief turns your thoughts into static. I told her I understood, even if I didn't fully. But I meant it. I respected the way she described her experience. The way she never dramatized it, but didn't sugarcoat it either. Eventually, the clock crept toward 10, and I knew I should leave. I stood slowly, stretching out the stiffness in my legs, and she walked me to the door again. There was a moment, just a small one, where I thought she might ask me to stay again, but she didn't. Instead, she placed a hand lightly on my forearm and said, "Thank you, not just for the help, for listening, for seeing me." I nodded, unsure of what to say that wouldn't sound like a line from a movie. No. So I said the simplest truth I could find: I'll be back tomorrow. And when I got home that night, I didn't turn the TV on or scroll my phone like usual. I sat in the quiet and thought about the day, about the way Evelyn had started to open up like a window that had been shut for too long. And I wondered what it meant that I felt pulled back to her house, not just for the work, but for the connection, for the way she made even silence feel like something worth sharing. The next morning came with rain tapping gently on the windows. I made my way over with a thermos of coffee and a small bag of muffins I'd picked up on the way. Evelyn opened the door wearing a thick cardigan and slippers, her hair slightly messy from sleep, and she smiled when she saw what I brought. We settled in the living room again, sipping coffee while the rain painted patterns against the glass. There wasn't much work left to do, not really. It's just a few final boxes, and then whatever she decided to keep or give away. But I didn't think either of us were in a rush to reach the end of the task. The boxes were the reason I came, but they weren't why I stayed. As the rain picked up, she reached for one of her old sketchbooks, the ones we had found in the basement, and opened it to a blank page. Her hand hovered over it for a while. Then slowly, she began to draw. Nothing elaborate, just soft lines, the beginning of a landscape. I didn't interrupt. I just watched, quietly honored to witness something she thought she had lost. The sound of pencil strokes on paper was the only thing filling the room for several minutes. I sat on the edge of the armchair, coffee in hand, watching Evelyn as she began sketching a row of trees. Her hand moved tentatively at first, as if testing whether she still remembered how to let lines speak without words. But as minutes passed, the movements grew more fluid. The rain outside hadn't let up, and I was thankful for that. It gave us an excuse to linger, to pretend we still had work to do. Even though both of us knew the real work had already begun days ago, and it had very little to do with moving boxes. I didn't speak. I didn't want to break whatever spell she was under. Her brow furrowed in concentration, and her mouth was drawn in a tight but focused line, kind that comes from rediscovering a long-lost part of yourself. Every so often, she would glance toward the window, like she was pulling shapes from the sky or the trees outside, and then return to the page with renewed energy. When she finally stopped, she held up the page and looked at it not with pride. Not yet, but with a kind of tenderness, like greeting an old friend. She passed a sketchbook to me. The drawing was simple. Trees bending slightly in the wind. Their leaves barely outlined, but clearly in motion, and a small figure under them holding an umbrella. It wasn't technically perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was honest. It was hers. I told her so, and she smiled, not out of vanity, but out of quiet relief. "That's the first thing I've drawn in nearly 5 years," she said, her voice low but steady. "It's strange how much you can miss something without realizing it, like your body remembers before your heart does." I nodded. I wanted to tell her how proud I was, how inspiring it was to see her reconnect with something that clearly ran deep, but the words felt too heavy for the moment. Instead, I offered to bring her more sketchbooks the next time I came, she said. She'd like that. We didn't talk about what it meant, whether she'd keep drawing, whether she'd start painting again. We didn't need to. The moment was enough. We spent most of that rainy day indoors. I helped her move a few more things out of the garages. Some tools. An old radio, a few plastic bins of tangled Christmas lights, and stacked them neatly under the back porch. After that, we returned inside and ended up in the kitchen, where Evelyn made soup from scratch with the kind of grace that made you think she'd done it her entire life. I offered to help, but she insisted I sit and keep her company, so I did, telling her stories about some of the odd jobs I'd taken over the years. She laughed at the one about the elderly man who insisted on supervising me while wearing a pirate hat, and at the woman who thought her toaster was haunted. Evelyn had a good laugh, soft but rich hand, when she let it out. It seemed to light up her whole face. As the soup simmered, she paused mid-chop and looked at me with a curious expression. "Do you ever think about what home really is?" she asked. "Not the walls or the furniture, but the feeling, the presence. What makes it feel alive?" I leaned back in my chair and gave it some thought. I told her that, for me, home had always been more about people than places. That sometimes a conversation with the right person in a strange city could feel it's more like home than sitting alone in your childhood bedroom. She nodded slowly, like my words stirred something in her. Then she said, "I used to think this house was my home. Now I wonder if it was just the container. Maybe the real home was Martin. And when he left, the roof stayed, but the heartbeat stopped." Her words hung in the air, heavy but not bitter. I didn't know what to say, so I reached for the wooden spoon on the counter and gave the soup a slow stir. "Maybe," I said finally, "but I think you're still here." Which means there's still heartbeat left. She didn't respond right away, but I saw her eyes shimmer just a little, as if something had loosened. She looked back at the pot and then back at me, and smiled. "You always say the right thing without trying to." That night after dinner, we sat by the fire she lit in the small living room hearth. It crackled gently while we sipped tea and watched the flames twist and settle. Evelyn's head rested against the back of her chair, her eyes occasionally drifting closed, not quite asleep, but not fully awake either. I felt peaceful in a way I hadn't in years. Maybe because the rhythm of our days was beginning to resemble something more than just coincidence. There was a softness to our connection now, an unspoken understanding that whatever had begun between us wasn't something either of us expected. But it was undeniably real. As the fire dimmed into glowing embers, I stood to leave, but she reached for my hand gently and looked up at me with eyes that carried both fatigue and comfort. "Stay a little longer?" she asked. "Just until the fire's out." So I sat back down, and we watched it together in silence. When I finally did leave, the rain had stopped. The street was wet and glistening under the streetlights. I walked to my truck slowly, feeling the weight of the day, not as a burden, but as something grounding. I'd finally started becoming part of something after drifting so long. The next few days followed a rhythm we both settled into easily. I would come by mid-morning, sometimes with muffins or coffee, and we'd tackle whatever small project remained: organizing a shelf, moving a bin, dusting a bookshelf. But more often than not, we simply spent time together. She'd sketch while I read, or we'd cook a simple lunch and eat it by the kitchen window. Sometimes we'd just sit and listen to the radio. Every now and then, Evelyn would open up a little more, telling me stories from her childhood, from her early marriage, about the time she and Martin tried to start a garden and accidentally grew 6-foot sunflowers that blocked all their neighbors' light. She was full of these little memories, and I came to treasure them as much as she did. It became clear to me that helping her with the boxes had never really been about the boxes. It was about giving her a reason to revisit the pieces of herself she had packed away for safekeeping. And maybe it was about giving me something too: a place to rest, someone to care about. A feeling that I hadn't just passed through her life unnoticed. One afternoon, after I had brought her a fresh set of sketch pads and some watercolor paper, she looked up from her chair and said, "I used to think the only kind of love worth having was the kind that sweeps you off your feet, the kind you read about. But maybe love is quieter than that. Maybe it's someone showing up, again and again." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, thinking how right she was, because that was exactly what this was becoming. Not a whirlwind, not a romance born from urgency, but something slow and intentional. No, something rooted and deep down. Knew I didn't want to leave, not just yet. A few more days passed in a rhythm so gentle that I barely noticed time moving. Morning coffee became our ritual. I'd show up with a thermos and something sweet from the bakery down the road, and Evelyn would greet me with that same expression: surprise, tinged with warmth, like she still couldn't quite believe someone was showing up just for her. We didn't always have a plan for the day, and that didn't matter. Some mornings we cleaned out drawers, others we rearranged furniture, or sat on the back porch wrapped in blankets, watching birds flutter through the trees. But in the quiet moments, the ones with no chores to occupy our hands, something deeper was happening. Something that made the air between us hum with quiet recognition. One afternoon, while I was fixing the back gate that had come unlatched in the wind, Evelyn came outside with a cup of tea in each hand. She stood on the porch and watched me for a moment, then stepped down slowly and offered me one. Her hair was tucked behind her ears, and she wore a soft gray sweater that looked a size too big, like she'd borrowed it from a memory. I sat down beside her on the porch steps, wiping my hands on my jeans before taking the cup. She sipped quietly, staring out into the yard. "Did you always know you'd end up doing this?" she asked. "This kind of work, I mean." I looked at the fence, then at her, unsure of how to answer. "Not really," I said after a moment. "I started helping out neighbors when I was a kid. Fixing squeaky doors, patching drywall, mowing lawns. People seemed to appreciate it, and I liked that feeling. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Over time, it just stuck." She nodded, considering that. "There's something comforting about things that stick," she said. "Like, they choose you instead of the other way around." We sat in silence for a while longer, sipping our drinks, listening to the occasional chirp of a bird or creak of the house settling. Eventually, she said, Martin and I had plans to travel. After he retired, we were going to buy an old RV and see the country. Even had maps pinned up on the wall, little flags marking all the places we wanted to go. But life had other plans. He got sick before we could take the first trip. Her voice didn't break, but I could feel the weight of the words settle between us. I used to stare at that map for hours after he was gone. I thought if I looked long enough, maybe I'd feel close to him again. But all it did was remind me of what we didn't get to do. I wanted to tell her that plans change, that life bends and breaks in ways none of us are ready for. But instead, I reached over and touched her hand. She didn't flinch or pull away. In fact, she let her fingers curl gently around mine, and for the first time since I met her, she didn't. Looked like she was waiting to be left. Later that evening, as I was getting ready to leave, She walked me to the door, like always. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden haze across the hardwood floors and turning the living room into something almost sacred. She hesitated in the doorway, and I could see something flickering behind her as a hesitation, a decision. Not quite ready to leap. Then she said it, softly, hesitantly, but like it had been pressing against her chest all day. I like having you here. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even romantic. It was a truth spoken into a quiet space, like a pebble dropped in still water, and the ripples hit me immediately. I felt it in my chest, in the way my throat tightened just a little and how. Suddenly, I didn't want to walk out that door. I like being here, I replied, matching her tone. She nodded, not smiling, just absorbing it. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "There's a local art fair this weekend. I haven't gone in years. Would you? Would you come with me?" I didn't need to think. "Of course," I said. "I'd love to," she nodded again. Then stepped back into the house. I turned to leave, but before I could make it down the steps, I heard her call my name. I turned, and there she was again, standing in the doorway with her arms folded like she was bracing herself. "I'm not good at asking people to stay," she said. "I've had to get used to them leaving." And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she added, "Please don't go. I'm scared to be alone." It was the first time she had said something so openly raw, not poetic, not veiled, in metaphor or softened with time. Just the truth, unfiltered. Her voice didn't tremble, but it didn't need to. It hit me like a wave, sudden and full of everything she'd been holding in since the first box, since the first awkward greeting. Since that first night I stayed for dinner, I didn't answer right away. I walked back up the steps slowly, closing the space between us. I didn't pull her into a hug, didn't make promises I couldn't keep. Simply looked her in the eyes and said, "You're not alone now, not tonight." And I meant it. Every word. We sat on the couch that night and didn't talk much. She leaned against me and I let her. The TV played some documentary neither of us really paid attention to. It wasn't about the show. It was about the warmth, quiet presence of another person. The confirmation that life, even in its loneliest chapters, could still offer company when you least expected it. I left late, only after she assured me she'd be okay, and even then, it took effort. I drove home with the windows down, the cool air pulling at my sleeves, trying to calm the emotion that had taken root in my chest. I had come here to help with boxes. That was all. A simple job, a few hours of labor. But now it was something else entirely, something unspoken, fragile, and real. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only just beginning. The morning after Evelyn whispered those words, everything felt different. Not in a dramatic, earth-shifting way, but in the soft, unmistakable way a room feels warmer when the sun hits it just right. I woke up earlier than usual and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time thinking, I wasn't used to this kind of wait, not the burdensome kind, but the kind that made you pause and breathe deeper. Her voice from the night before still echoed in my mind, that quiet plea carried not from weakness, but from years of carrying everything alone. It humbled me, and it made something stir inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time, a desire to show up for someone not out of obligation, but because I truly wanted to. I picked up a few groceries on my way over that morning. Nothing fancy: eggs, bread, oranges, coffee. Things that filled a kitchen and made it feel like someone lived there, not just existed in it. When I arrived, Evelyn answered the door wearing a long cardigan over her pajamas, her hair tucked into a messy braid and her eyes still heavy with sleep, but she smiled when she saw me. And something about that simple expression made everything inside me settle. I figured we could make breakfast, I said, holding up the bag. She stepped aside and let me in. Only if you let me make the coffee. We moved around the kitchen like two people who had done this for years. No awkwardness, no second-guessing. She handed me a skillet and pointed to the eggs while she ground fresh beans and filled the kettle. The windows were fogged slightly from the cool air outside, meeting the warmth inside. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee filled the air like comfort itself. We didn't speak much as we cooked. It wasn't necessary. The clinking of utensils, the soft sizzle of the eggs, and the occasional glance across the counter were enough. We ate at the kitchen table, and it felt less like a shared meal and more like a continuation of something that had started the night before. The silence wasn't empty, it was the kind of silence that held hands with understanding. After breakfast, Evelyn disappeared into the living room for a few minutes and returned with a folded piece of paper. She set it in front of me without a word. I opened it and found a poem, handwritten in neat, elegant script. The lines were simple, yet deeply moving. They spoke of quiet mornings, of coffee, steam, and second chances, of rediscovering how to let someone in after years of forgetting how. She hadn't signed it, but she didn't need to. I wrote it this morning, she said, her voice soft. It just came to me. I thought maybe I was done writing years ago. I was wrong. I looked up at her and smiled. It's beautiful. She shrugged slightly, but I could see the faintest trace of pride in her eyes. It felt good. Like breathing. Again. We spent most of the afternoon organizing the small guest bedroom upstairs. It had become a kind of catch-all for items Evelyn didn't know what to do with: old curtains, unused bedding, a few unopened boxes she hadn't dared to look inside since Martin passed.
As we worked through the clutter, she told me about how they had once planned to turn that room into a library.
He was always reading, she said with a fond smile. Even at the breakfast table, sometimes with his glasses halfway down his nose and a book propped up against the milk carton. We laughed about that image, and I suggested we could still make it into a small library. She looked at me like she was considering it for the first time. Maybe, she said. Maybe it's time. That was the moment I realized how much she was changing. Not drastically, not all at once, but gradually and with intent. She was beginning to imagine again, and that, more than anything, told me she was finding her way back to herself. That evening, we sat outside on the porch with cups of chamomile tea. The sky was clear for the first time in days, and a breeze rolled through the yard, rustling the leaves like a whisper. Evelyn pulled her cardigan tighter and looked up at the stars. I used to sit out here with Martin every evening in the fall, she said. We'd count stars until our eyes got tired. It was our way of saying goodnight to the world. Glanced up at the same sky, then let's say goodnight to it together. She didn't respond right away, but I saw her eyes soften. We sat like that for a long time, wrapped in quiet and surrounded by memory, and for the first time in a long while she looked more peaceful than sad. The next day was the art fair. I arrived early, dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans, and brought her a bouquet of fresh flowers, nothing elaborate, just a few sunflowers and daisies tied with a ribbon. She looked surprised when I handed them to her, but not in the way someone is caught off guard in the way someone hasn't received something simple and beautiful in a very long time. We walked to the fair together, our steps unhurried. The town square had been transformed with booths and stalls, local artists displaying paintings, pottery, handmade jewelry. The air was filled with the scent of roasted nuts, cinnamon, and fresh popcorn. Evelyn moved through it all with wide eyes, like she was seeing it for the first time. Even though she had lived in this town for decades, at one booth, she stopped to admire a series of watercolor paintings. The artist, a younger woman with paint-streaked hands and a warm smile, asked if Evelyn was an artist too. I saw her hesitate, and then she said, I used to be. I gently nudged her. Still is, I added. The artist offered to let her try a brush stroke on a blank canvas she kept nearby. Evelyn looked at me, then at the brush, and slowly reached out to take it. She painted a single leaf delicate, with curved edges and soft green tones. The artist beamed. You've got a hand, she said. Don't stop now. Evelyn smiled, and it was the kind of smile that seemed to stretch across all the years she had spent holding back. We walked away with her still holding that small canvas. I think I'd like to paint more, she said as we moved through the crowd. Forgot how it made me feel. As we found a bench near the edge of the fair and watched the people wander by, she leaned her head lightly against my shoulder. No words were spoken for several minutes, and none were needed. Something had shifted again, not just in her, but in us. We were no longer simply two people sharing space. We were beginning to share something more enduring. I didn't know where. It was all headed. I didn't need to. What mattered was that she was no longer afraid to be seen, no longer afraid to create. And little by little, she was no longer afraid to let someone stand beside her in all of it. The week that followed moved in a way I hadn't expected, slow but not stagnant. Each day with Evelyn felt like an unspoken conversation continuing. From the day before, she didn't say much about what had changed since the art fair, but I didn't need her to. It was in the way she carried herself, shoulders a little straighter, voice a little steadier, laughter a little easier. There was still a fragility there, of course, but it no longer felt like she was tiptoeing around herself. She was simply allowing the broken parts to breathe, and that in itself was something to admire. One morning, I pulled into her driveway to find her outside, already knee-deep in a mess of flower pots and soil. She looked up with dirt on her cheek and a grin that surprised me. "I hope you're not afraid of a little gardening," she said, pointing to the bags of mulch beside her. I laughed and rolled up my sleeves, stepping into the yard without a second thought. There was something about seeing her like that elbows deep in soil, hair pulled back with wisps, falling loose around her face, that made me feel like this was how she was always meant to be. Not hidden in corners or fading into the walls of her own home, but alive, expressive. Rooted in the present, we spent the better part of the day replanting marigolds, hydrangeas, and a few patches of lavender. She told me stories between scoops of dirt, stories I hadn't heard before, like the time she and Martin tried growing tomatoes on their balcony in the city and ended up feeding half the building because they'd underestimated how fruitful they'd be. Or how she used to press flowers between the pages of poetry books, keeping little pieces of spring with her through the winter. Every memory she shared seemed to carry two truths at once, the joy of what once was and the pain of what would never be again. But she told them anyway, as though saying them aloud gave her permission to keep the joy without being drowned by the loss. By mid-afternoon, we were both exhausted, but Evelyn insisted we sit and admire our work before calling it a day. We took our spots on the porch steps again, drinking iced tea this time, and looked out over the freshly turned garden. It wasn't perfect. Some flowers drooped slightly, and one of the mulch bags had torn, leaving a streak across the grass butt. It was ours. A shared effort. A testament to something growing again. She leaned over slightly, brushing her shoulder against mine. "It feels different now," she said. "The house, the yard, even the quiet, like it's not so heavy anymore." I nodded, watching a butterfly land on one of the marigolds. "That's because you're filling it again," I said. "With new stories, new colors." She looked at me for a long moment, then turned her gaze back to the garden. "I never thought I'd have new stories," she admitted. "Not at my age. Not after everything." "You do," I said. "You're making one right now." We sat in silence again, but this time it was thick with meaning. I felt the gravity of everything unspoken, the mutual understanding, the comfort, the slow and subtle healing. This was no longer about helping her move boxes or fix loose boards. It was about standing witness to someone choosing to live again. And it was about letting myself be part of that choice. Later that week, Evelyn invited me over for dinner. It was the first time she'd done so with purpose. No pretense of needing help. No chore to serve as a reason. Just dinner. She had spent the day cooking roasted vegetables, herb chicken, and something she called a slightly overambitious lemon tart. The table was set with linen napkins and candles that looked like they hadn't been lit in years. She wore a soft green blouse and a pair of silver earrings I hadn't seen before. Not in the way magazines sell it, but in the way someone looks when they're stepping fully into their own life. We ate slowly, savoring both the food and the ease between us. Conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on books we loved, music we missed, places we'd once dreamed of visiting. At one point I asked her what place she would go to first if given the chance. She didn't hesitate. "Iceland," she said. "For the stillness. For the sky. and because I think I need to feel small in a place that reminds me I'm still part of something bigger. I didn't laugh or question it. I just said, then maybe we'll go someday. She looked at me, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to determine whether I meant it. I didn't elaborate, and I didn't need to. The idea was enough for now. After dinner, we took our tea to the living room. Evelyn put on an old jazz record, soft horns, brushed drums, a piano like warm rain. Sat across from each other, legs curled under us, hands wrapped around warm mugs. There was something magnetic in the air, a tension that wasn't discomfort, but possibility, the kind of stillness before a leap. She spoke first. "Do you ever wonder why you came here?" she asked. "Why it was my house, my boxers, my life." "You walked into?" I thought about that for a long second. "I used to think life was a series of random assignments," I said. "You show up, you do the work, you move on. But lately, I don't know, lately it feels like maybe we end up exactly where we're needed." She smiled, small and slow. "That's what I've been thinking too." The record played on. The lights dimmed slightly as the last of the sunset filtered through the curtains. I felt her watching me, not with hesitation, but with quiet assurance, as though she was allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, not everyone leaves. But before the night ended, before I could stand and say goodbye, she reached out across the small table and took my hand. "Thank you," she said, "for not leaving." On the third evening, just as the sun was beginning to tuck itself behind the line of trees at the edge of town, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone.
Added.
Barefoot across the floor and opened it, and there she was, Eliza, holding a paper bag in one hand and a folded umbrella in the other. She looked a little windblown, a little unsure, but her smile was soft. And when I stepped aside to let her in, she moved like someone who had made up her mind to stop hiding. "I brought dinner," she said simply, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "Hope you still like pad thai." I smiled and nodded, and we moved into the kitchen, as if no pause had happened at all. She unpacked the food while I got out plates, and we stood shoulder to shoulder again, like we had so many times before. Except this time, there was something quieter threading between us. Not tension, not distance, just mutual awareness. A shared understanding that we were stepping back into something worth protecting. We ate at the small kitchen table. No music, no TV, just the sound of our forks and the occasional creak of wood beneath our feet. About halfway through the meal, she set her fork down and said, "There's something I haven't told you. Something I've been holding close, because... ... Well, because I didn't want it to scare you off." I looked up, met her eyes, and waited. She took a breath, long and deliberate, then continued. "Before I moved back here, I was living in New York, working in publishing, mostly editorial management. I was good at it. The job consumed me, honestly. 12-hour days, weekend calls, non-stop deadlines. I built a life around work because I didn't know how to build one around anything else." She paused, eyes flicking to the window like she was watching some old ghosts walk by. "And then I got married. His name was Colin. Charming, ambitious, the kind of man who knew how to fill a room. We met at a conference. I thought he saw Mareely. Saw me, but what he saw was someone who made him feel important. And I mistook that for love." Her voice didn't shake, but there was a tightness in it, a tension carefully held between each word. I didn't interrupt, just let her speak. "He didn't hit me, not physically. But sometimes the worst bruises are the ones you can't see. He had a way of making me feel small, insignificant, like everything I did was either not enough or too much." I stopped recognizing myself. My laugh became quieter, my steps more careful. I stayed for 6 years. She looked at me then, and for a moment she looked afraid not of me, but of what her story might change in my eyes. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers, grounding her there. "I left on a Tuesday," she continued, "packed a single suitcase, called a car service, and never looked back. Quit my job 2 weeks later and came here, to this quiet little town with its crickets and peeling paint and no subways. I thought if I could just disappear for a while, I could remember who I was before him." Her hand trembled slightly under mine. I gave it a gentle squeeze. It's taken me 3 years to feel like I can breathe again. And even now, there are moments small, stupid ones where I second-guess everything. That message you didn't respond to right away? It wasn't about you, Ben. It was about all the other times someone made me feel invisible. I nodded, letting her words settle. You're not invisible to me, Eliza, I said softly. Not even for a second. Her eyes welled, but the tears didn't fall. She blinked them back and smiled dry, a little sad but real. I know. That's why I came. We cleared the plates slowly, lingering in the small spaces between tasks. Washing, drying, putting things away. It wasn't about the dishes, it was about creating rhythm again, reestablishing that sense of shared movement that we'd both started to crave. Even if we hadn't said it out loud, afterward, we sat on the couch, close but not touching. The quiet hum of a table lamp filling the room with a soft glow. She leaned her head back and let out a sigh that sounded like relief. Do you ever wonder, she asked, if the people we become after heartbreak are stronger or just better at pretending? I thought about that for a moment, then answered, I think we become more honest, more careful with where we place our hope, but stronger. Yeah, because choosing to try again, that's not weakness. That's courage. She tilted her head to look at me. And what about you? What are you still carrying? The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because I hadn't realized how much I'd been avoiding asking it of myself. I told her the truth. About my ex, about the years of surface-level relationships that left me feeling lonelier than being alone ever did. About how I'd buried myself in work, thinking I could sidestep vulnerability if I just stayed too busy to notice what I was missing. But then you walked into your kitchen with that peach-colored notebook, I said, and reminded me that stillness isn't the enemy. That real connection isn't loud, it's steady. I didn't even realize how much I missed that until you gave it a name. She looked down, then back up. What name did I give it? Home, I said. You feel like home. This time the tears did fall, quiet, clean, and without apology. I let them come, let her lean gently into my shoulder, and we sat like that for a long time. The quiet between us no longer uncertain, but full of promise. The days that followed, that quiet night in my living room, unfolded with a kind of unspoken agreement between us, one not defined by rules or expectations, but by presence. Eliza didn't need constant reassurance, and I didn't need to over-explain my every movement. We'd passed through a threshold that left both of us change-draw, yes, but more open. She would text me little things throughout the day, a picture of a strange vegetable at the market, a quote she found in one of her old novels, a blurry photo of her coffee cup with the words I thought of you. I responded in kind, sending snapshots of half-finished repairs. It's an old favorite song playing on the radio. Or simply letting her know when I was heading to lunch in case she wanted to meet. On Thursday morning, we fell into what was quickly becoming a tradition breakfast at her kitchen island while the sunlight angled through the windows. She had on a loose white cardigan, her hair still damp from a shower. And she looked so relaxed that I almost didn't recognize the version of her I'd first met. That woman had carried everything tight in her shoulders and behind her eyes. This woman laughed easily and stirred her coffee slowly, like she wasn't in a rush to be anywhere else. We spent the day working on her garden boxes, something she'd talked about for weeks but never gotten around to. I dug up the soil while she planted herbs, rosemary, thyme, and basil. She knelt beside me in the dirt, not caring about the smudges on her knees, and told me about her grandmother's garden. How they used to make herbal tea from scratch, and how she'd always dreamed of a life slow enough to let things grow. That hit me harder than I expected, the simplicity of it. The clarity of knowing what you want, not in grand terms, but in the smallest, most honest details, by early evening. We were resting on the back steps, arms brushing as we drank lemonade from mason jars, the scent of fresh soil still clinging to us. It was quiet, not the kind of silence that needed filling, but the kind that said everything without a word. That's when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and felt a jolt of surprise. It was Yvonne, old friend from my hometown, someone I hadn't seen in years but who had always been a fixture in my early adult life. We'd worked together briefly when I was just starting out. Our bond had been one of those rare, easy friendships that sometimes toe the line of something more without ever quite crossing it. "Hey, I'm in town for a conference," her message read. "Would love to catch up, even just for coffee." I stared at it for a second longer than necessary, not because I was unsure of how to respond, but because I felt Eliza's presence next to Muriel, solid grounding, and I realized how easily a message like that could throw dust into the air. She must have noticed something shift in my posture because she asked, "Everything okay?" I nodded, setting the phone down, screen side down. Just an old friend passing through. "Wants to meet for coffee." She didn't press. Just nodded and looked out across the garden. But I caught the faint pull of a thought behind her eyes. It wasn't jealousy. I don't think that's how she worked, but something quieter. Pause. A hesitation. "You should go," she said a moment later, her voice even. "It's good to see people who know the parts of you from before." I appreciated the way she said it. No bitterness, no edge, just understanding. But I also knew enough about Eliza now to realize that sometimes her grace was a shield. Learned to be the bigger person, even when something stung. I texted Ava back, said I could meet her for lunch the next day, then slid the phone back into my pocket. For the rest of the evening, the conversation drifted back to easy topics. What herbs needed the most sunlight? Whether or not her compost bin was doing anything at all, but underneath it all was a small, almost imperceptible shift. A reminder that despite how close we'd grown, there were still parts of our lives that didn't fully belong to each other. Not yet. Needed the most sunlight. Reminder that despite how close we'd grown, there were still parts of our lives that didn't fully belong to each other. Not yet. Needed the most sunlight. The next day, I met Ava at a small cafe just off Main Street. She looked exactly the same sharp smile, wind-tousled hair, wearing a faded leather jacket, and the kind of ease that comes from living a life full of motion. We talked about old jobs, people we used to work with, how strange it was that time could stretch and fold without warning. She asked if I was still doing contract work, and when I told her about settling in this smaller town, her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Wow," she said. "You always said you needed to keep moving, or you'd go crazy." I smiled at that. "Turns out stillness isn't so bad," she grinned. "Ah, so there's someone." I didn't deny it. I told her about Elisa carefully, but honestly, about how we'd met, how things had grown slowly, how she wasn't like anyone I'd known before. Ava listened without interrupting, then simply said, "I'm happy for you. Ben, you always needed someone who would meet you where you are instead of trying to change your pace." When I returned to Eliza's place that evening, she was in the kitchen, making soup, her hair up, music playing low from her phone. She turned and gave me a half smile, one that tried to pretend she wasn't bracing herself. "How was coffee?" she asked, not looking at me as she stirred. "Good," I said. "It's familiar in the way that reminds you how much you've changed." That made her pause. She turned to face me fully then, eyes soft. "And did it remind you of something you missed?" "Joel," I said, stepping closer. "It reminded me why I don't miss it." There was a long moment where neither of us moved, where the silence brimmed with possibility. Then she smiled, genuine this time, wide enough to crease the corners of her eyes, and handed me a spoonful of broth to taste. "You're going to want to marry me after this soup," she said lightly. I tasted it, laughed. Too late, I already do. She rolled her eyes but didn't correct me. And in that moment, with the scent of rosemary and garlic filling the kitchen, I realized something vital. Love doesn't always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it shows up in spoons of soup, in shared soil, in soft smiles after old friends reappear. Sometimes it settles in quietly, so gently you almost don't notice until one day you do. And you can't remember what life felt like before it. The following week unfolded with a sort of quiet steadiness between us. Not the kind that lulls people into complacency, but the kind that felt like we were finally finding our rhythm to separate lives, brushing edges, and learning how to move in sync. I found myself reaching for my phone before I even made my morning. coffee. Wanting to send her a photo of the sunrise through my dusty truck window, or a quick joke about something I heard on the radio, she replied just as quickly, often with that dry humor I'd come to appreciate, or sometimes just a single sentence that said more than paragraphs ever could. Don't forget the world moves slower when you're paying attention. She'd once texted me after I said I was rushing through the day. I reread that line 3 times before responding. One afternoon, as we were sitting on her back porch with mugs of tea in a folding chair I'd brought from my truck, her curled up on a blanket-draped wicker bench, she casually mentioned that her younger sister was coming into town the following weekend. She hasn't been back since last year, Eliza said, running her finger along the rim of her mug. Always busy with her job, her husband, her twin boys, but she tries. She glanced at me briefly. They're doing a small get-together at my mom's place. Backyard kind of thing, just family. There was a pause just long enough for me to catch the shift in her voice. The subtle way people test the waters before asking something slightly vulnerable. She didn't say it outright, but it was there in the silence. So I asked gently, "Are you thinking of going?" She nodded. "Yeah, I haven't been to one in a while. Things with my mom have gotten easier." Another pause. "You don't have to come. Just if you wanted to. I wouldn't hate it." It was the first time she'd invited me into a space that extended beyond just the two of us. A space where her past and present intersected, where family history ran deep and sometimes uncomfortable. And I knew what that kind of invitation meant. It wasn't casual. It wasn't just a barbecue. It was a step forward, a glimpse into the life she was rebuilding. And by extension, she was wondering if I might want to be part of that. "I'd like to go," I said, and the relief in her face was subtle but unmistakable. So, Saturday rolled around with the early bloom of spring in the air. Everything smelled like cut grass and warming earth. I wore my best pair of jeans and a clean button-down, kind I usually reserved for meetings with new clients or holiday dinners back home. When I showed up at her house, Eliza stood on the porch in a soft, blue sundress, hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, sunglasses dangling from her fingers. She looked beautiful in a way that didn't try like herself, just more open. The drive to her mother's place was filled with small talk, soft music and the occasional moment of silence that didn't need filling. She seemed calm, but I could tell she was bracing herself. Family gatherings, especially the ones where old expectations sat just below the surface, had a way of stirring up things people thought they'd buried. Her mother's house was a modest ranch-style home with a wide lawn and folding chairs already lining the perimeter of the backyard. Kids were chasing bubbles near the garden beds, adults carrying paper plates with deviled eggs and barbecue, someone shouting instructions over a cornhole game set up by the back fence. The moment we stepped onto the lawn, the air changed. Heads Turned, smiles formed, a few eyebrows lifted. "Eliza," a woman's voice called. Soon she was pulled into a hug by someone who had her same eyes but a brighter, more effusive energy. Her sister, I guessed. She glanced over at me with curiosity and a slight smirk. "And you must be Ben." The introductions followed like a wave. Her mother, stern, but softening with age, greeted me with a brief nod and a tight-lipped smile. Her uncle made a joke about finally seeing Eliza bring someone decent-looking around, and the kids, her nephews, eyed me curiously, like I was a new character in a story they hadn't been told yet. Throughout the afternoon, I floated between conversations, refilling drinks, helping stack cups, talking with her cousin about tools, and home repairs. But every few minutes I'd glance over and find Eliza watching me, It's not in a possessive way, but in a quiet, almost disbelieving way. Like she was still adjusting to what it felt like to have someone on her side in a space she used to walk through alone. At one point, while we stood side by side at the buffet table, she reaching for salad, me grabbing cornbread, she leaned slightly closer and whispered, "This feels weird." "Weird good or weird bad?" I asked. She smiled, dipping a carrot into some hummus. "Weird vulnerable," I nodded. "That's usually where the good stuff starts." Later in the evening, after dessert had been cleared and the sun began slipping behind the tree line, her mother called her over to help bring something out of the garage. Eliza went, leaving me with her sister, who stood beside me, sipping wine from a mason jar. "She's different with you," her sister said quietly. I turned toward her. "In what way?" "Calmer, more settled. She's always been strong. But lately, she looks lighter. Like she doesn't have to hold everything by herself anymore." I didn't know how to respond to that, but I appreciated it. It was a kind of silent endorsement, the kind that didn't need much dressing. When we left that evening, driving back through winding streets and blinking porch lights, Eliza reached over and rested her hand on my knee. She didn't say anything. At first, just stared out at the passing trees. But then as we hit the turn toward her neighborhood, she said, "Thanks for showing up." That might have been the most important sentence of the day. That night, as we sat on her porch with a shared blanket over our legs and 2 mugs of chamomile tea between us, I realized something had shifted. We weren't just figuring each other out anymore. We were starting to build something with shape, with weight, with memory, and the beauty of it was, neither of us needed to say the word future aloud. We were living it already. The days following the family gathering carried a sense of soft momentum, like we'd reached a new chapter without speaking it aloud. Eliza seemed lighter, less guarded, even playful in ways I hadn't seen before. She'd nudge my arm when I teased her, send me early morning texts with photos of her coffee and a caption that simply read, "Still here," and I without even realizing it had begun carving out space for her in my daily routines. I started picking up extra napkins when I got lunch to go, knowing she'd forget to grab some. I kept her favorite tea stocked in my kitchen. Her laughter had become a fixture in my week, something I missed if I didn't hear it. But change, even the good kind, has a way of rattling the old dust loose. Inside, after we'd washed up, she made us a light lunch, grilled cheese with tomato soup, her comfort meal, she called it. She told me stories while we ate, one about her first car, a yellow Volkswagen Bug that always stalled in the rain. Another about the time she got caught sneaking out to a summer concert as a teenager. These weren't stories of heartbreak or loss. These were stories that made her laugh until her shoulders shook, and I realized how much of her I hadn't yet met. Grief had been the curtain, but behind it lived a woman full of color, mischief, and quiet rebellion. After lunch, she surprised me with a small project. "I've been meaning to clean out the garage," she said, half apologetic. "There's a lot in there I've been ignoring." I followed her through the back door and into the musty space filled with boxes, tools, and the kind of forgotten clutter that only accumulates when life has paused for too long. We worked slowly, side by side. She'd open a box, glance through it, then hand it off for sorting. Some went to the donate pile, some back on the shelves. On some, like the collection of old cassette mixtapes, made us pause. She picked one up, squinting at the faded label. "Summer 1993, she read aloud. "We made this on a whim during a heat wave. Played it during every road trip." She walked over to a dusty boombox, popped it in, and pressed play. Scratchy tracks started up Fleetwood Mac, followed by Elton John, then a song I didn't recognize, but she began to hum along to immediately. She swayed slightly, eyes closed, hands resting at her sides. For a moment, she was somewhere else. Then she opened her eyes, caught me watching, and said, with a sheepish grin, music was how we traveled when we couldn't afford to. We'd just roll the windows down and drive until the gas tank begged us to stop. By evening, the garage was tidier, and Evelyn looked different, lighter. Like clearing the space had also cleared something inside her. We stood by the workbench, sipping lemonade from chipped mugs, watching the sunlight filter through the dusty windows. She looked at me thoughtfully, then asked, "Do you believe people can have more than one great love in their life?" I didn't answer immediately. not because I didn't know, but because I knew too well how loaded the question was. After? A long pause, I said, I think some people get lucky once, and others, well, they get surprised when it happens again. She didn't respond, but the way she looked at me said she heard exactly what she needed to. That night, as I packed up my tools and prepared to leave, she walked me to the door, as always. But this time, just before I stepped outside, she hesitated. Her hand brushed mine again, slower now, more intentional. Would you like to stay for dinner tomorrow? She asked. I was thinking of making something real, not just soup or sandwiches, maybe lasagna. I smiled and nodded. I'd like that. As I drove away, the sky bloomed into lavender and gold behind me, and I found myself humming the tune from one of her mixtapes. It stuck with me all the way home, not because of the melody, but because of what it now meant. Shared history, not mine, but welcomed. A soundtrack to a story that was still unfolding. Back at home. I sat on the porch with a drink in hand, letting the day settle. I thought about her question, again about great loves and second chances. I thought about how life doesn't always give us the kind of closure we expect, but sometimes it offers an open door instead. And when someone brave enough whispers, "Please don't go," maybe what they're really saying is, I'm ready for whatever this becomes, as long as you're still in it. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready too. The next day felt different from the start. Not because of anything dramatic, but because of the quiet anticipation that settled over everything I did. I went about my morning with more care than usual, folding laundry with deliberate neatness, cleaning out the cab of my truck, even though it didn't really need it. By the time late afternoon arrived, I had stopped by the grocery store for a bottle of red wine. It's the kind that seemed appropriate for a lasagna dinner, even though I wasn't sure if Evelyn drank anymore. When I pulled into her driveway, the windows glowed warmly from the inside, and the smell that met me as I stepped out of the truck was nothing short of comforting roasted tomatoes. Garlic, something cheesy bubbling in the oven. It felt like walking into the promise of something good. Evelyn greeted me at the door wearing an apron dusted with flour and a slightly flustered smile. Her hair was pinned up messily, and there was a streak of sauce on her cheek. She laughed as I pointed it out, wiping it away with the back of her hand. "This is what happens when you try to make everything from scratch," she said, stepping aside to let me in. The house felt warmer than usual, not just from the oven, but from the effort she'd put into it. The table was set with mismatched but polished dishes. Candles flickered softly near the centerpiece, a small vase with clippings from her herb garden. And there was music playing low from the living room, something instrumental and slow. Handed her the bottle of wine, and she raised an eyebrow in mock surprise. "Red?" she asked. "You were trying to impress me?" "Maybe a little," I admitted, and she smiled like she appreciated the gesture more than she'd say aloud. We talked while she finished assembling the last layer of the lasagna, the kind of effortless conversation that now flowed between us like second nature. She told me how she used to cook for her parents on Sundays as a teenager. How Martin had once tried to make pasta from scratch and ended up turning the entire kitchen into a flour storm. I shared a few of my own kitchen disasters: burnt toast that set off alarms, an attempt at baking that ended with cookies hard enough to chip teeth, and she laughed until her eyes shimmered with it. When we finally sat down to eat, it was every bit as good as it smelled. It's rich, flavorful, and made with an attention that couldn't be faked. We took our time, savoring not just the meal, but the quiet pauses in between. The way her eyes lingered on mine when I complimented her cooking, the way her smile softened when she told me she hadn't done this in a long time, not since Martin, not since the house had felt full. It wasn't an admission of sadness, but rather one of change, of stepping forward into something new. After dinner, we cleared the table together, and then she brought out a small dessert she'd made, something light and lemony. We ate it on the couch side by side, the music still playing, the lights dimmed just enough to make the moment feel suspended. Eventually, our conversation drifted to quieter things: regret, time, the strange ways life reroutes us when we least expect it. She looked at me then, not with longing, but with an openness that invited truth. "Do you ever think about what you might have missed by always moving around?" she asked. I nodded. All the time. But then I also think maybe I needed to be lost in order to know what it felt like to find something worth staying for. There was a silence after that, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just full of something unspoken. And then she leaned her head lightly against my shoulder. Not a dramatic gesture, just enough contact to say, "I'm here." I stayed still, letting the moment expand. I could feel the rhythm of her breath, the rise and fall of a heart no longer grieving in isolation, but beginning to beat beside someone else's. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter than before. I used to think life stopped. When Martin died, not literally, but in the ways that mattered, like nothing after could mean as much. But I'm starting to realize, meaning doesn't have to compare, it can just be new. I turned to her, met her eyes, and said, "New doesn't mean less. It just means different." She smiled, and I saw a kind of acceptance in her expression. Like she was letting go of something she'd held on to for too long, not erasing it, not replacing it, but finally making space beside it. We didn't talk much more that night. There was no need. When it was time for me to leave, she walked me to the door as always. But before I could open it, she reached for my hand and held it for a few seconds longer than usual. Her eyes didn't search mine this time. They simply stayed with them. She said nothing, but her hand said everything, and as I stepped out into the cool evening air, I realized that some dinners weren't just meals, they were turning points. Quiet, ordinary markers of change where something previously unspoken finally found its voice. Back in the truck, I sat for a moment before turning. The key, letting the hum of what just happened settle into my chest. The sky above was cloudless, stars beginning to appear in quiet bursts. And I couldn't help but think that if this was what staying felt like, if this was what slow, careful love looked like, it was worth every mile I'd traveled to find it. The following morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that only arrives when something shifts deep inside you, quietly but permanently. I didn't check my phone first. I didn't rush out of bed. I just sat for a while, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Evelyn and how the night before had unfolded without ceremony or expectation, yet somehow felt more significant than anything loud or dramatic ever could. There was no kiss, no declaration. But her hand in mine, the way her voice had softened, and the way her eyes held mine in that lingering moment at the door, those were the kinds of truths that didn't need words. I spent the morning on smaller jobs, wrapping up some tasks I had pushed back earlier in the week, but my mind wandered constantly. I replayed our dinner, her laugh, the scent of her homemade sauce still hanging in memory like a familiar fragrance. I thought about the mixtapes we'd found in her garage, and I wondered if she might show me more photos, old paintings, pieces of a life she was slowly beginning to dust off. It amazed me how healing worked not all at once, not in some cinematic crescendo, but gently, like vines curling around a fence, finding grip, finding shape again. That was what Evelyn was doing, and in her own quiet way, she'd pulled me into that same process. By the time the afternoon light began shifting toward gold, I was already back in my truck driving toward her street without even needing to decide. It was instinct now. Her place had become the place I gravitated toward, not out of obligation, but because it had begun to feel like a point on the map where something meaningful waited. When I pulled up, she was already outside, kneeling by the herb garden we'd planted just days before, gently pinching away the browning edges of the basil leaves. She looked up, saw me, her face lit with something that looked like peace. "I was hoping you'd come by," she said, rising to her feet and brushing her hands against her jeans. "I was thinking of repainting the hallway today, remember?" Smiled, stepping out of the truck and closing the door behind me. "Of course I remember. I wouldn't dare let you start a project without me." We spent the next few hours prepping the space. She had already picked out the color a soft sage green that she said reminded her of calm. We moved the furniture, covered the baseboards, and started rolling the paint onto the walls, working side by side in that now familiar rhythm of quiet coordination. There was music playing again, this time a little louder, a playlist she'd made of old jazz records, and acoustic folk songs that somehow matched the pulse of the day. Somewhere around the second coat, we paused to let the paint dry. Sitting on the floor with our backs against the opposite wall, sipping lemonade from mason jars like we had the first time we cleared her garage, she leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes, the corners of her mouth twitching with a half-smile. "This house feels different lately," she said after a while. "Not just because of the paint or the garden. Feels like I can finally breathe in it again." I didn't speak right away. I just watched her, the way the light hit her face, the way she said that sentence like she meant it more than she understood it. Then I said, "Maybe it's because you're finally filling it with life again." She opened her eyes and turned toward me, her gaze steady. "Or maybe it's because you brought life with you when you walked through the door." It wasn't flattery. It wasn't flirtation. It was just truth, simple, earnest truth that landed between us like a gift. I looked at her and smiled, not with surprise, but with the quiet understanding that this connection we were building, slowly and without rush, was no longer something fragile. It had begun to settle into something real. Later that evening, we finished the hallway, cleaned our brushes, and stepped back to admire our work. The walls looked fresh, like they had shed the shadows of old years and were ready to hold new memories. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, head tilted in that familiar way, and nodded once, satisfied. "It's funny," she said. "How a coat of paint can make you feel like you've rewritten the story of a room." I thought about that long after I drove home that night, about the power of reinvention, about how even in the middle of your life you can start again, not by erasing the past, but by layering something new over it, something that allows both the history and the hope to live side by side. That night, I sat on my porch again, the air cooler than usual, the stars sharper, and I found myself thinking not just about Evelyn, but about how I had changed too. How the man who arrived at her house just a few weeks ago, tired, drifting, expecting nothing, was slowly being replaced by someone steadier, someone who stayed, and all because of a woman who had once whispered that she was scared to be alone. It's not knowing that in doing so, she had reminded me how good it felt to be chosen, trusted, and gently welcomed into a space where real healing was allowed to grow. The days that followed seemed to stretch and soften at the same time, each one folding into the next with a kind of quiet ease that neither Evelyn nor I spoke about directly. We didn't define what we were becoming, didn't use the words relationship, or dating, or any of the labels that might box in something still forming, but our actions filled in the blanks more honestly than words could have. I came by nearly every day now, not always for a task or a project, but sometimes just to sit with her in the backyard, listening to the wind move through the trees or sipping tea while the sky faded into its evening hues. It wasn't about doing it was about being, and that was something neither of us had experienced in a long time. One afternoon, she surprised me with an idea. She wanted to visit the old flea market in the next town over, a place she hadn't returned to since Martin passed away. "Used to go almost every month," she said softly, "but I haven't had the heart to walk through it alone." I could hear in her voice that it wasn't just about the market, it was about reclaiming something that used to bring her joy, even if it had been tangled in memory for years. So we made a plan, Saturday morning, early, with coffee and open hours ahead of us. When I picked her up, she wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and sunglasses, her hair tied back in a loose braid, and she smiled like someone cautiously excited to see what the day might hold. The drive itself was peaceful. We talked about the little things: music, books, food, but under the surface was the deeper rhythm we'd settled into. The mutual understanding that we were helping each other unstick from the past. The flea market was buzzing with life, the way those weekend spaces often are: vendors calling out prices, kids darting between booths, the smell of kettle corn mixing with fried foods and fresh lemonade. Evelyn seemed lighter there, moving between tables with curiosity, fingers brushing old records and antique teacups, pausing to admire a set of wind chimes made from sea glass. I watched her closely, not to monitor, but to memorize. This was her in motion, reawakening, rediscovering. She picked up a worn paperback with a cracked spine and turned to me with a grin. "I read this when I was 16. Cried so hard I had to bury it under my bed for a week. She bought it, along with a vintage scarf and a faded painting of a coastal town that reminded her of a childhood trip. I didn't buy much, just an old brass key with no lock to match. I told her I didn't know why it called to me, just that it did. She looked at me then for a long, quiet second and said, "Maybe it's not about finding what it opens. Maybe it's a reminder that some doors only open when the time is right." We stopped for lunch at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind with cracked leather booths and servers who called you hun. She ordered a tuna melt and I had a turkey club. And somewhere between the fries and the refills, she reached across the table and brushed a crumb from my chin. The gesture was small, but it startled something awake in me, a kind of tenderness I hadn't let myself feel in years. I didn't speak on it then. Neither did she. But when we got back in the truck, her hand found mine as naturally as breathing. And for several miles we drove in silence, fingers interlaced, music low, windows down. That evening, back at her house, we unpacked her finds and arranged them around the living room. The scarf draped over a chair, the painting hung near the front entry, the book placed carefully on her nightstand. Each item was like a breadcrumb leading back to parts of herself she had long buried beneath grief. And I realized, watching her from across the room, that I was witnessing a resurrection, not dramatic or sudden, but steady and full of grace. She poured us each a glass of wine, and we settled on the couch, her legs curled beneath her, my arm draped gently behind her shoulders. The air between us had changed. It wasn't charged or heavy. It was present, full. She turned to me after a while and asked, "Do you ever think this? Whatever this is too good to last." It was an honest question, a vulnerable one. I took a moment before answering. I used to think that anything good was temporary. Now I think maybe the good things only vanish when we're too scared to hold them with both hands. She leaned into me then, head resting on my chest, and whispered, "I don't want to be scared anymore." And I held her tighter, not because I had the answers, but because I wanted to be the kind of man who stayed steady, even when things felt uncertain, especially then. That night, after I'd left and was lying in my own bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about all the times in my life I'd run. From places, from people, from feelings that seemed too big or too close. But this time, I hadn't run. And that changed everything. The next morning came slow and quiet, filled with the kind of peace that settles deep into the bones. I got up, early, more out of habit than necessity, and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring out at the early morning stillness. The breeze was soft, the sun barely lifting above the horizon, and in that calm, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed over the past few weeks. When I'd first met Evelyn, she was a stranger with grief wrapped tightly around. Her like armor and I was just another pair of hands helping carry her boxes. But something had unfolded between us since that day. Something rooted not in grand gestures or declarations, but in the quiet consistency of showing up, of being there. I had come into her life to help for an afternoon, but somehow I had become part of her rhythm. Later that day, I swung by her house without a plan. There was no project scheduled, no task on the list, but I knew that if I showed up, she'd open the door with that warm smile and invite me in like she always did. And she did. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, barefoot and humming to herself as she mixed something in a bowl. The house smelled like cinnamon and apples. And for a second, I just stood in the doorway watching her, just wondering how I had ever gone so long without something that felt this grounding. She looked up, saw me, and grinned. "I had a feeling you'd show up," she said. "I made a pie. Figured if it turned out awful, I'd need someone to help me eat the evidence." We sat on the back patio while it baked, talking about nothing and everything. She told me about a dream she'd had the night before. Something about a beach and a lighthouse, and how she'd woken up feeling like she needed to write it down. "Maybe I'll start journaling again," she mused. "I used to do that before everything got too heavy." I encouraged her, told her that sometimes writing things out helped make sense of them, helped pull the tangled threads of memory and emotion into something that resembled clarity. She nodded, thoughtful, and I could see the idea take root in her. When the pie was done, we took it inside, let it cool for a bit, and then each had a slice topped with vanilla ice cream. It wasn't awful. In fact, it was pretty good, and she beamed when I told her so, swatting my arm with a towel when I teased her about turning domestic. After that, we spent a lazy hour reorganizing her bookshelf, a task she'd mentioned in passing and I had remembered. We ended up sitting on the floor surrounded by stacks of books, paging through old favorites, laughing at some of the titles, reading aloud bits of poetry or underlined quotes that had once meant something to her. At one point, she pulled out a leather-bound journal and flipped it open to a page dated nearly 10 years ago. "This was right after my mom passed," she said, her voice quiet. "I wrote in here every day for months. I thought if I stopped, I'd forget how to grieve properly." She handed it to me, and I scanned the page and entry full of raw emotion, elegant but heavy, full of longing and the kind of love that lingers. I handed it back, not saying anything, but she looked at me like I had anyway. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, she reached over and rested her hand on mine. "You've been good for me," she said, the words landing soft but solid. "I don't know what this is we're building, but it feels like something real, something I didn't think I'd ever feel again." I squeezed her hand gently, not needing to respond with words. The way I looked at her, the way I stared, those were the answers. That evening, we took a slow walk around the neighborhood, the kind of unhurried loop people make when they just want to be in each other's company a little longer. We talked to a couple of neighbors, waved to kids on bicycles, admired someone's blooming rosebush. When we circled back to her house, she stopped at the walkway, looked at me with a kind of hopeful hesitation, and said, "Do you want to stay a while? Maybe watch something. I've got this old movie I've been meaning to show someone who'd actually sit through it." I followed her in, and we settled onto the couch with a blanket draped over us, the flicker of the TV casting soft light across the room. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and as the movie played, I barely noticed the plot. I was too aware of the way her breath synced with mine, the way her hand found its way to rest lightly on my chest, the way time seemed to stretch around us, protective and kind. It wasn't about romance, not exactly. It was about presence, trust, the gentle decision to let someone in when it was easier to stay guarded. And as I sat there beside her, I realized something important. I wasn't waiting for a signal or a green light. I wasn't looking for a perfect moment. I was already in it. The days moved gently after that. It's not because life suddenly became perfect, but because the heaviness that once sat between us had started to lift. Evelyn seemed brighter, more at ease in her own home. She began opening the windows more often, humming to herself while folding laundry, even taking long walks on her own just to clear her mind. I didn't need to be there every day, but I usually was. Sometimes we'd just read quietly in the same room. Other times we'd work on odd tasks together, placing a squeaky door hinge, trimming back her garden, organizing old photo boxes she had long avoided opening. Each moment was simple, even ordinary, but layered with a kind of silent meaning neither of us tried to name. We didn't have to. One late afternoon, I came by with a small gift, a second-hand wind chime I had found in a thrift shop 2 towns over. It was delicate, made of pale green and blue glass, and when I held it out to her, she took it like I had just handed her something fragile and precious. She hung it on a hook near the porch, and as it caught the breeze, it filled the air with soft, irregular music. "It sounds like memory," she said, barely louder than the chime itself. I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew. That evening, we sat outside and watched the light change, the wind chime marking time as the shadows stretched across her yard. Evelyn turned to me, a thoughtful look on her face, and said, "I think part of me believed I'd spend the rest of my life talking to ghosts." Not literally, of course. But I thought I'd never get past the ache of remembering, that every day would feel like some quiet tribute to what I'd lost. She paused, took a deep breath. "But it doesn't feel like that anymore, at all. The time, and that's unexpected." There was a vulnerability in her words that didn't demand reassurance, only presence. So I gave her that, just sitting there, steady, listening, without needing to fix anything. She reached over, touched my hand, and left it there. We didn't speak for a while, letting the silence stretch around us like a blanket. And when the first star appeared in the darkening sky, I realized something had changed in me too. I had stopped drifting. I'd stopped running. For the first time in a long while, I felt anchored to a place, to a person, to a version of myself I hadn't known was still possible. Later, before I left for the night, she walked me to the door as always. But instead of letting go after a quick hug, she held on a little longer, resting her head against my shoulder. And then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, she whispered, "I don't know where this is going, but I don't want it to stop." Neither did I. The following week unfolded like the slow turning of pages in a well-loved book. Evelyn and I settled into a rhythm that didn't need explanation or approval. It wasn't about defining what we were or setting timelines. It was simply about existing alongside each other, showing up consistently, and letting the connection speak for itself. Some evenings we'd cook together, passing ingredients back and forth in her kitchen while soft. Jazz played in the background. Other times we'd sit outside watching the moon rise, wrapped in a shared silence that had grown increasingly comfortable. There was no rush. We were learning how to breathe again individually and together. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in warm orange hues, Evelyn suggested we go through an old box of letters she had found in the attic. "They're from years ago," she said, brushing dust off the lid. "Some from my sister, a few from college friends. Even some I wrote to myself after Martin died but never mailed." I followed her into the living room where she placed the box on the coffee table like it was something sacred. We sat down together, and slowly she began pulling out envelopes, each one yellowed with time but still intact. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady as she read snippets. Aloud, her voice carried both nostalgia and strength. Some letters made her laugh, like the one where her younger sister detailed a disastrous camping trip in hilarious detail. Others quieted her, especially the ones she had written to no one, just trying to survive the days when the grief was too loud. She passed one to me, a letter she'd written 2 months after losing Martin. In it, she described waking up and forgetting he was gone, only to feel the crash of memory seconds later. "I didn't think I'd ever stop reliving that moment," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But she had, not forgotten but softened. He wasn't a shadow hanging over her anymore. He was a part of her, woven into her strength, but not defining her future. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. My hand found hers, and we sat there as the dusk settled fully into night. The wind chime on the porch sang a faint tune, and the flickering light of a nearby candle painted golden shapes on the wall. Eventually, she leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder like it belonged there. "You've made this house feel alive again," she murmured. "I used to feel like I was just waiting around in it, waiting for the past to disappear, or for me to disappear with it. But now, when you're here, it feels like a place where something new is growing." I didn't reply. I just pulled her a little closer and let the moment do the talking. Whatever we were building, slow, imperfect, beautifully unscripted, was real. And more than that, it was ours. It wasn't long after that evening with the letters that I found myself pausing outside her front door, hesitant for the first time in weeks, not because anything had gone wrong, but because the feeling growing between us was no longer quiet or subtle. It had become something undeniable. Something that hummed beneath everything we did. And I was starting to wonder what came next. The unspoken space between friendship and something more had narrowed so much that even a shared glance carried a weight to it. When she opened the door, barefoot and smiling in that familiar soft way, I knew that whatever was going to happen, it was coming soon. We spent that day repotting the plants on our back patio. The old ceramic pots had begun to crack, and Evelyn had picked up some new ones from the nursery the week before. We knelt. Side by side, our hands coated in soil, sun warming our backs. It was messy, ordinary work, but it felt like a metaphor for everything else. Taking roots that had outgrown their containers and giving them space to expand. When we finished, we stepped back to admire the row of green life, now standing taller in their new homes. "They needed that," she said quietly. "They couldn't keep growing where they were." Later, as twilight set in, she invited me to stay for dinner. It was the kind of evening where the world felt tucked in, hushed, and gentle. She had lit a few candles around the kitchen, and the scent of rosemary chicken filled the air. We talked about nothing important: movies, neighbors. The pie recipe she was determined to perfect, but beneath our words was something deeper. Anticipation. Till we ate, we sat on the couch again, as we often did, the distance between us slowly disappearing. I could feel the moment pressing in, asking us to acknowledge it. Then she turned toward me, eyes serious but soft. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. I nodded, already knowing it was something that mattered. That first day you came here, I was drowning in loneliness. I didn't say it out loud, but I was. And when I asked you not to go, I wasn't asking for help with the boxes. I was asking for someone to see me, really see me. I didn't think anyone would ever want to again. I reached for her hand, holding it tightly. She didn't pull away.
Emily.
Her fingers closed around mine like they belonged there. "You weren't invisible," I said quietly. "Not to me, not ever." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned in slowly, carefully, like someone unsure if the ice beneath them would hold. And when our lips met, it wasn't fireworks or something rushed. It was steady, deep, and honest. Like everything else we'd built, we didn't say anything afterward. We didn't have to. We just sat there, together, while the night wrapped around us. And for the first time in a long time for both of us, it felt like the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to look forward to. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.